could become species. That's his main thesis. The next chapter, of course, is variation under nature. He says, okay, it's not just humans that breed fancy pigeons. These variations occur in nature. Now, he doesn't use Canada geese as his example. I just put this one in because it's of interest to us. Did you realize that, that there are actually different varieties of Canada geese out there? I didn't until I did a little bit of research. They all look pretty much the same to me. But here's two different variations or races. We're not allowed to use that word anymore. Varieties, subspecies. Okay? Subspecies is also a bad word. But you get the point, right? Okay, so different kinds of Canada geese. The different size. If you're an expert in birds, you don't have too much trouble telling them apart, and you know that they're not species. Well, he talked about many examples like this from his own observations of natural varieties, not domesticated, not selected by humans, but varieties like this that occur in nature. So how do they occur in nature? How does this happen in nature? Remember now, the case is that these are incipient species. These are species in the act of forming. So the next chapter he talks about the struggle for existence. This comes from his reading of Malthus, which basically the idea is that as the human population grows to be too large, people are going to die because you can't sustain huge populations. So this happens in nature as well. You can't keep on breeding forever and ever. Eventually you reach a point where individuals are going to compete with each other, and only the strong will survive. So there's a struggle for existence within nature. And these varieties, one of them is likely to win out for some reason. Why? Because it has features that make it better or superior to the other variety. So the struggle for resistance invariably follows from the high rate at which all organic beings tend to increase. And down at the bottom he mentions, it is the doctrine of Malthus applied with manifold force to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms. So this is where he's introducing the reason why some varieties will survive and some won't. These are natural varieties. They're not domesticated varieties. So what is it? It's natural selection. So he calls it this preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations. I call natural selection. So it's not man-made selection, it's natural selection. It happens in nature. That's the explanation for the origin of species. They come from varieties, and some varieties will be superior to others in terms of survivability, in terms of number of offspring. So you can see simultaneously he is convincing us and his audience that species are not fixed. Instead, there are many varieties within most species, many variants. There are subspecies, there are incipient species, and over time, one of them will win out, and they will win out because in the struggle for existence by a mechanism which he calls natural selection. His idea, all of his ideas are fundamentally connected to his study of geology, based largely on the work of his friend Charles Lyell, who wrote a series of books on geology, which Darwin took the first volume with him on the Beagle and had the others shipped to him while he was traveling. And the essence of what Lyell was saying is that everything you see in geology, all of the geological formations that you see have come to be, have come into existence over long periods of time by very slow and gradual processes. He's arguing against catastrophic events. He's arguing against the flood or special creation. He's saying, look, okay, all these layers of it, that could be slow accumulation of sediment over millions of years. A concept which is called uniformitarianism, which Lyell didn't invent but strongly promoted. Darwin's putting that into the biological context. He's saying the same thing happens in biology. just as mountains form very slowly from uplifts, okay, and coral atolls form as the volcano sinks, and the atolls the coral is built up by organisms over millions of years, so too species change, life evolves, new species come into being over periods of thousands and millions of years. So it's a concept then, the geological concept brought into biology, very much part of his thinking. He then discusses chapter 5, which is the most problematic part of his book. So there's variation, and where does it come from? There's a whole chapter devoted to the laws of variation, which really is an attempt to explain where this variation comes from. Remember that at least some of the people reading his book are going to think, well, it was created. God did it. And he says, no, there has to be a natural origin of this variation. Why is one goose big and one goose small? We don't have any trouble. We know it's mutation, but he didn't know about mutations, right? So he was trying to explain where variations came from. He mostly thought it was caused by use and disuse of various organs, that the more an organism used an organ, the more likely it was going to be passed on. It wasn't strictly Lamarckian. It's a little complicated, but he didn't know about mutation. He thought that variation arose. Okay, it's not something which is always present. It arose, but it arose by slow and gradual processes related to use and disuse. Then chapter 6, which is the most remarkable chapter. It's an entire chapter devoted to objections to his theories. He calls it difficulties on theory. It's one of the reasons why we admire Charles Darwin so much. It's one of the reasons why we hold him up as the first real scientist, a real biological scientist, and the best scientist in the world. So he discusses 4 main objections. The lack of transitional forms. If life has evolved, and species have slowly and gradually changed over time, then you expect to see lots of intermediate forms, both in the fossil record and living forms, as species are continually changing today. We don't see them, and he has several explanations. Lack of forms in the fossil record, as we'll see shortly, he explains because the fossil record is nowhere near complete. Actually quite rare for fossils to form. Lack of transitional forms in modern species. We don't see Canada geese that are halfway between those two variants. That's basically what he's saying. Why don't we see those? If in fact if they have a common ancestor. And he's saying, well, for 2 reasons. First of all, that they have a common ancestor, right? So they resemble, the 2 of them will resemble the common ancestor. It's not that one came from the other. They evolved from a common ancestor. So you're not expecting to see an intermediate that's half the height of the, halfway between the short goose and the tall goose. Perfectly correct and insightful observation from 1859. He also says that many of these changes take place very quickly. So that there's a reason why you don't see some of the intermediates, is because that intermediate stage of evolution from a common ancestor often occurs fairly quickly. He addresses very complex organs like the eye. How in the heck can I say that something like the eye could really evolve? He says, because it did. Okay? And he was smart enough to know that there were lots of different kinds of eyes in various species. He was smart enough to point to them all, from the sort of pinhole camera type eyes of some fish, to different kinds of eyes of octopus, to light sensitive organs on the surface of some protozoan, which he knew about. He says it's not really a problem, as long as if you study hard, you'll often see evidence of